From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. I'm Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the African Middle East Division, and I'm delighted to see you here. I always make our little spiel for the video that we're filming, and also for those of you who are not familiar with this division. The division is made up of 3 sections: the African section, the Near East section, and the Hebraic section. Between the 3 sections, we cover 78 countries in the whole of Africa, Central Asia, the Middle East, and we're sort of expansionists. We go through to Afghanistan and beyond, and we hold programs regularly. Programs that inform, programs that give greater depth to knowledge about those countries. So it's not only that we collect materials, that we serve those materials, that we hope we're preserving the memory of those countries, but we also try to invite scholars, artists, poets, writers, to talk about the countries that they know better than we do, because if their career, their life, their work has focused on those countries. Today, we have a specialist, an expert, and an old friend of the library and of the section, a wonderful photographer, who has been here before, who has worked on Mali, who has lived in Mali, and who has come specially for today's event to share with us her knowledge, her expertise, via a book of magnificent photographs. We've acquired these photographs already, at least some of them. We've acquired a few. In the Prints and Photographs division, and you could all see them. And we are absolutely delighted that Alexandra Huddleston was able to join us today. So to introduce her, Marita Harper, who has focused on Mali for many, many years and is responsible for our Timbuktu website, and has been one of the greatest supporters of Alexandra's work. Marita Harper is going to introduce the speaker today. So thank you.
Thank you, Mary Jane. I'm going to start with saying good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for coming. As Mary Jane said, I'm one of the area specialists in the African section of the African and Middle Eastern Division. I generally assist researchers in locating information at LC on the Sahel area, which covers today's topic. Today's book talk will cover the ongoing scholarship work for centuries in Timbuktu, which is located on the edge of the Sahara Desert. In 2002, I participated in the Ink Road Conference in Bamako, Mali. The primary purpose of that conference was to develop strategies on where to find the manuscripts in West Africa and other areas of the continent, and most importantly, to find means to continue preserving them. The aged manuscripts were and are still fragile and subject to environmental issues of global warming as well as man-made disasters. I saw the manuscripts in Timbuktu where for centuries scholars kept them as teaching tools on mathematics, religion, astronomy, law, and many, many more subjects. It was in 2003 that the Library of Congress digitized some of the manuscripts for Timbuktu. Those manuscripts were returned to Timbuktu after the filming here at the Library of Congress, and later I will give you the website to look at them. Right now, within the past year or two, these manuscripts have been endangered by some radical Islamic invasions that took place from 2012 to 2013 in northern Mali. And they have been moved from Timbuktu. So some of the manuscripts that were digitized here are not in Timbuktu at the moment. Excuse me. On December 1, there were newspaper articles that I carried, which had an article about the problems as they progress. It's called Islamic Silence Northern Mali's Music Tradition, which is part of the scholarships work that was ongoing in Timbuktu. Now, I need to introduce today's lecturer. Alexandra Huddleston will be providing more insight into these manuscripts and what has happened to them from 2005 to 2007, and which will give you more detail other than this article I just mentioned. The background that I have for Alexandra Huddleston is she is an American photographer who was born in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and grew up in the Washington, D.C. area and in West Africa. Her work has been published and exhibited worldwide. The title of today's lecture will center on 333 Saints, A Life of Scholarship in Timbuktu. Ms. Huddleston.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start the presentation with this 5-minute video that I made in 2012. I made it for 2 reasons. At that time, as you may well know, the whole issue of the invasion of the north of Mali by different groups, Tuareg groups and radical Islamist groups, had occurred. The occupation was ongoing, and those groups that were occupying Timbuktu were in the process of destroying the UNESCO World Heritage Sites that were the shrines of the 333 saints. So the issue of Timbuktu, the issues of Timbuktu's cultural patrimony were incredibly pressing at that time. I felt that my photographs and what I had learned about the traditional scholarship could help shed light on the current events. And so I created this video and put it online. As a result, the video is a bit dated, so it's for now 2014, but it still gives a really good background on the situation, and it still presents my own work and my own photography very well as a brief introduction before I elaborate. Timbuktu is a small city on the southern edge of the Sahara Desert that developed as a crossroads for trans-Saharan trade. While in Western lore, Timbuktu epitomizes the end of the earth, in African history it is known as a center of scholarship and wisdom. Timbuktu's legendary tradition of scholarship and the ancient manuscripts it created are still part of a living culture at the heart of the city's religious and secular life. I stayed in Timbuktu for 10 months in 2007 to photograph this tradition of learning and of teaching, the ancient culture of Arabic language scholarship that has been passed down from teacher to student since the 15th century. Although I am a woman and an American, I was welcomed into Islamic religious and scholarly sanctuaries. What I found was an intellectual tradition as complex as any in Europe or in the US, with its own canon of classic texts in subjects as diverse as poetry, grammar, law, religion, and mathematics. It's a pedagogy covering over 5 centuries of knowledge that was in the past spread throughout West Africa. The scholarly tradition in Timbuktu has long included and valued women. Moreover, it has been a shared culture for multiple ethnic groups in the region, including the Tuareg, Berbers, Arabs, Songhai, and Fulani. In Timbuktu, there is a profound conviction that to be a saint is to be a man or woman of knowledge, whether by long study or by divine inspiration. Therefore, to be a scholar is to be on the path to sainthood. Since Timbuktu fell under rebel control at the beginning of April, a militant Islamist group, Ansar Deen, has imposed strict Sharia law. They have destroyed shops that sold alcohol or played Western music, and enforced separate schooling for girls and boys, all against protests from the local population. They have also destroyed civic monuments and desecrated multiple UNESCO World Heritage Sites, including the mosque and shrines to many of the city's 333 saints, declaring the local tradition of praying at these tombs to be un-Islamic. Over half the population has fled, driven by fear of the city's lawlessness and by the lack of medicine, food, water, and electricity. From the beginning of my work, I knew that I was photographing a culture threatened by change, but the threat was a gradual pressure of outside influences. In 2007, the scholars complained about the influence of rap music, Brazilian soap operas, and Western fashion, as well as about the radicalism of new imams, educated in the Middle East in a militant Islam that was alien to the local way of life. With the city falling under the control of Ansar Deen, militant Islam has become a far greater threat to Timbuktu's tradition of scholarship than any outside influence of fashion, music, or television could ever be. The Quranic schools and majlis of Timbuktu have long taught a moderate form of Islam influenced by Sufism and characterized by tolerance, plurality, and a deep joy in and respect for learning. This culture is now under attack by violence, greed, and religious intolerance. This video is a call for all those involved in Timbuktu's future to respect the freedom of religion and cultural self-determination of its citizens. It's a call to protect a living religious and scholarly tradition that is one of the great cultural legacies of humanity. No short-term political, economic, or religious gain justifies the destruction of knowledge. Timbuktu scholars have long known this. The famous 16th century Timbuktu scholar Ahmed Baba is known to have quoted the hadith that states, "The ink of the scholar is more precious than the blood of the martyr." Timbuktu scholars still have much to teach us about freedom of conscience and religious tolerance. So again, thank you all for coming. This afternoon, I'll talk about scholarship and Islam in Timbuktu. I'll also talk a bit about the tragic current events that have brought the north of Mali to the front page of the international press this last year. And I'll also talk a bit about the crowdfunding and the publishing that went into making my book. So these are all, of course, huge topics. So I definitely hope you make sure to address your specific interests by bringing them up in the question-answer portion of the event. I say this in particular because I know that Timbuktu is a place so surrounded by myth and legend that it probably exists as a completely different reality in your mind than it does in mine. And after living in Timbuktu for 10 months in 2007, the city became for me a very personal and even a very normal place. To take the photographs and do the research that went into my book, I lived with a Malian family. My Malian family, the Kati family, ran one of the city's private manuscript libraries. They traced their descent from the Songhai emperors of Mali, as well as the Visigoth kings of Spain. And the room I lived in there was 50 meters away from 7,000 ancient manuscripts. At the same time, on a day-to-day level, my main concerns consisted of figuring out what I should do between 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. when it was too hot to even go outside, or figuring out and deciding in turn how to entertain or how to avoid the many very active children of the household. But let's backtrack a little bit. How, you may well ask, did I decide to spend 10 months living and photographing in Timbuktu? As has been said at the beginning, my relationship to Africa goes back to my youth, in fact, my birth. I was born in Sierra Leone, and I lived in Bamako, Mali for 3 years as a child. So I have a very long-term interest in the region. In 2003, when I returned to West Africa as an adult and as a photographer, I quickly learned about the ancient manuscripts of Timbuktu. At that time, there were plenty of articles in the international press about the subject. However, during the time I actually spent in Timbuktu and my meetings with those involved in manuscript preservation when I was there, I also learned about the ancient scholarly tradition that had actually created the manuscripts. And that was still active and evolving to our day. This was something that most of the news articles failed to mention, and in fact still fail to mention. Because after all, the reason that the libraries exist in Timbuktu is the reason that libraries exist all over the world. Scholars study books, they collect books, and then they write new books of their own. We are standing here in a testament to that, in fact. So I realized the potential in this story, and this spurred me to apply and fortunately receive a Fulbright Grant, which enabled me to do my research and my photographs. So although I had quite a bit of experience traveling and working in Mali before I started the project, I actually started it with relatively little knowledge about Islam. And what I realized in the course of my work was that understanding the role of Islam and the role of traditional education in the culture of Timbuktu, and actually in Mali as a whole, was in fact essential and at the core of understanding the entire society. During the colonial era, the French very consciously adopted a policy of neglect towards Mali's traditional system of education. And that attitude has been perpetrated or continued in the post-colonial era by both foreign NGOs and Malian elites. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that these groups basically often act as if traditional education will simply disappear if they ignore it. To be more specific in the case of the French, I should add that they also worked actively to co-opt these Quranic schools and transform them into French schools, and they were successful in doing that. But they also had an overall policy of neglect towards the ones they weren't actively involved in changing. Even now, there's a great amount of prejudice against traditional Arabic-based education in Mali, in particular against the Quranic schools, which are the most elementary level of education in the traditional system. And it's true that there are some practices in some forms of Quranic education that have become distorted and corrupted in the modern era. Of course, it's a vicious cycle because a lot of the corruption comes from a lack of resources, which in itself is exacerbated by the neglect. For example, some of you may know, children in itinerant Quranic schools, and not all Quranic schools are itinerant, but those in itinerant Quranic schools generally beg for their meals. And this system was actually developed as a means of universal education because it meant that the community supported the education of the children, and even the poorest children could go to school. However, unfortunately, there are times, especially in larger urban centers nowadays, where children only learn to beg and they don't learn to study. However, in the last century, despite the neglect, Quranic schools and the system of Arabic-based education as a whole has never disappeared. And I feel that it never did because it's still at the core of Malian culture. And it still provides an essential service in the moral, religious, and cultural education of the vast majority of Malians who, at least for a few years in their youth, will attend a Quranic school. So traditional education also still trains the religious and cultural leaders of the community. For example, in Timbuktu, when a child is born, an afawe officiates at the baptism. An afawe is a learned woman who is trained in the ritual Arabic blessings used in ceremonies connected with women. And when boys are circumcised, the local marabout imams will also gather to officiate at the ceremony. The same is true of a marriage. The same is true of a death. In fact, every single life event requires the presence and the participation of a marabout, an imam, or an afawe, who has gained their particular knowledge through the system of traditional education and scholarship. The same, of course, is also true for the many religious celebrations, from Ramadan to Mawlid to Eid. So it's no exaggeration to say that the cultural and religious education of Timbuktu's children, as well as the entire ceremonial life and life cycle of the city, is completely dependent on the system of traditional scholarship. So I hope you're beginning to see, as I did, why this ancient pedagogy did not disappear, and even if it's been neglected by state structures. So this brings us to a very fundamental question. We are now starting to see how scholars are involved in the ceremonial and religious life of Timbuktu, but otherwise, just exactly how and why is scholarly culture linked with religion, in this case in the form of Islam? There are a few very clear answers to this question, and then there are a few more esoteric ones. I'll start with the basics. The system of Arabic language scholarship arrived in West Africa along with the Muslim religion, and it spread primarily along the trade routes. Timbuktu, as a key stop along the trans-Saharan trade routes, naturally developed as a center for trade as well as a center for scholarship. Religious studies, which include Islamic law, history, and the analysis of the Quran and Hadith, have always formed a backbone of the pedagogy, just as those who ruled the city with the benefit of this pedagogy, the imams, sheikhs, and qadi, traditionally formed the backbone of the cultural and religious hierarchy. But before colonialism, more secular subjects like poetry, literature, mathematics, and medicine were also an important part of the curriculum. In the colonial era, the French-based state schools largely took over the secular subjects, and so the religious and cultural subjects came to dominate the traditional system of education. However, I actually think that some of the more esoteric answers are the most important in understanding this visceral link between scholarship and religion, and scholarship and faith, I think is even a better word, in Timbuktu. In the Muslim world, the Arabic language always has a special importance because it's the language of the Quran, considered the direct word of God. However, Islam in West Africa has a particularly strong mystical component that comes from both animist traditions in the region and the Sufi brotherhoods. So part of this mysticism is a belief in the power of the written word, and most especially the word of God as written in Arabic. So the word has power if you read it, if you write it, if you touch it, if you memorize it, if you drink it, if you say it, if you hold it close to your body. Scholars, who are essentially men and women, who are always reading, writing, memorizing, touching words, are therefore always potentially in contact with God's power. So it actually took me quite some time in Timbuktu before I started to understand this. But finally one evening I was sitting with Hawa, who is a good friend and the mother of the Kati family. And it occurred to me to ask, if you had written a passage of Quran on a little scrap of paper, just as a note or a reminder, would you throw that away? And she was quite surprised by my question, and she replied immediately, no, of course not. You would keep it, even until it disintegrated. Hawa's answer not only shows exactly how important the written word is in this cultural context, but it also very clearly shows why many families, who were and still are often extremely poor, would never consider selling their manuscripts. The possession of those books, of all of those words, holds a real power and a real blessing. So to give or sell that blessing away from the family would be unthinkable. Having a scholar in the family also brings a similar type of blessing. The word used is baraka. Scholars, in turn, can also bless, which explains their central importance in ceremonial life. Understanding this belief in the power of the word and the sanctity of scholarship also explains, of course, why Timbuktu is a city of 333 saints. In Timbuktu, to be a scholar is, by definition, to be on the path to sainthood. And to be a saint is to be a man or woman of knowledge, whether by long study or by divine inspiration. So quite naturally, Timbuktu, the center of West African scholarship, the home over the centuries of so many learned men and women, is also the city of 333 saints. Scholarship and religion in this way form the center of Timbuktu's identity, and this is one reason why, when I heard about the rebel takeover of the city in April of 2012, I understood immediately that the very heart of the culture was under attack. When the militant Islamists took over Timbuktu last year, it was not only alcohol and TV and Western clothing that were banned. What they attacked was also, and perhaps most violently, in fact, it was the city's practice of a moderate Sufi-influenced Islam. This includes the celebration of Maulud, the worship at the shrines of the 333 saints, the reverence for the manuscripts, and the basic belief in a tolerant and inclusive form of Islam, one that celebrates music, that includes women in schools and commerce, and one that values study, scholarship, and reason over indoctrination. The most visible sign of this attack was the destruction of the tombs of the saints, which most of you probably read about, structures that had been classified as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So now, if you consider what I've said about the connection between saints and scholars, I think it becomes very clear why this attack on the tombs was also an attack on the culture of scholarship, and why the citizens of Timbuktu knew without a doubt that their manuscripts were also in danger. Of the many things I learned about the people of Timbuktu during my time there, perhaps the most striking was their pride in and their love for their city and for their culture. So it was no surprise to me that most people in Timbuktu hated the rule of the militants. They worked heroically at the risk of their lives to save the city's manuscripts, and they cheered the French intervention, though I am still in awe of their courage in these dangerous times. Nonetheless, the city's future and its cultural future is still completely uncertain. There now exists an enormous rift among the different ethnic groups. Tourism, which was the main source of income, will be very, very slow to regrow, and many of Timbuktu's citizens, especially its more prosperous and well-educated citizens, are, of course, very hesitant to return someplace where their safety and livelihood are completely uncertain. Unfortunately, there is something I know for sure. War changes people and it changes cultures. The effects of last year will be strong and lasting on the culture of Mali and of Timbuktu. And what these changes will be is as yet unclear to me. If you read the most recent articles from the last couple of weeks, there's good news. March 14th, the first stones were laid in rebuilding the shrines in Timbuktu. There's also bad news. A lot of reports that the radical groups have been seen and active throughout the north of Mali again. So the future is yet very unclear. This is one reason I knew that I needed to publish my book as soon as I could. All photographs change from images of the present into documents of the past eventually. However, that change happened to my photographs overnight. In one day, what had been a project about the endurance of Timbuktu's ancient scholarly culture into the present, which is what I intended the work to be, it became a historical document about Timbuktu's scholarly and religious culture in a pre-war era. Last April, I already had been looking for a publisher for the book for over a year. I found several, but as is now unfortunately very common with art books, they all wanted me to bring them $20,000 or more to publish the book. Moreover, in the process of submitting my manuscripts, I heard many comments like, "You have to downplay the Islam angle," and other viewpoints that made me rather hesitant to place my work in the hands of someone who didn't fully understand the project. Sadly, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the book is important for the very reasons that most publishers, even some academic publishers, were afraid to make a financial commitment towards it. Last summer, I finally decided to self-publish and to finance that publication through crowdfunding. And although the entire process was very stressful and incredibly time-consuming, I definitely think it was the best decision for me, both artistically and financially. For many years, the internet, while an amazing tool, has drained money away from content producers, whether journalists or artists or writers, even as it thrives off, it's this hungry maw that thrives off of what we produce. We are finally beginning to see some tools like crowdfunding that allow us to bring revenue back into our hands, but that's only going to happen if we as artists take an active role in their use. The difficulties I faced in publication of my book are not censorship per se. They by no means compare with the violent suppression of music and other forms of expression under Islamist rule in the north of Mali, or frankly, the suppression of journalism in the south of Mali after the coup. Nonetheless, I know from personal experience that of myself and of my peers that artists of all sorts in America at this time, especially young emerging artists, are facing enormous difficulties in getting their work out to the public and dare I say it, in getting it out in a way that earns us a bare minimum to continue to do what we're doing. Why does this matter? Why is art important? These are questions that I grapple with constantly in times of economic difficulty, of terrorism, of war. Does art matter? Do manuscripts matter when people's lives are at stake? Does music matter when other people don't have enough to eat? My answer is yes. Art and manuscripts, music and poetry, shrines and books matter more than ever in such times. I'm going to end this part of the presentation with a quote from Seamus Heaney from his essay, The Government of the Tongue. And this essay is part of a book of essays also named The Government of the Tongue, all of which meditate in various forms on this persistent question: does art matter? And in particular, how does it matter in times of war? And for those of you who don't know, Seamus Heaney is an Irish poet who, for much of his life, of course, was working under a situation of conflict and also of religious conflict. So he was living these questions himself. Heaney writes, I want now to offer two further texts for meditation. The first is from T.S. Eliot, 44 years ago in October 1942 in wartime London, when he was at work on Little Gidding. Eliot wrote in a letter to E. Martin Brown. And here it begins the T.S. Eliot quote. In the midst of what is going on now, it is hard when you sit down at a desk to feel confident that morning after morning spent fiddling with words and rhymes is justified activity, especially as there is never any certainty that the whole thing won't have to be scrapped. And on the other hand, external or public activity is more of a drug than this solitary toil, which often seems so pointless. That ends the Eliot quote, and Seamus Heaney now continues. Here is the great paradox of poetry and of the imaginative arts in general. Faced with the brutality of the historical onslaught, they are practically useless. Yet, they verify our singularity. They strike and stake out the ore of self, which lies at the base of every individuated life. In one sense, the efficacy of poetry is nil. No lyric has ever stopped a tank. In another sense, it is unlimited. It is like writing in the sand in the face of which accusers and accused are left speechless and renewed. From his writing, it is clear that Seamus Heaney believed deeply, as do Timbuktu scholars, and as do I, in the power and in the importance of the word and of the book. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your meaning of the word and the scholarship that has been with us for centuries from the area we call Timbuktu. And with that, I would love for entertain any questions that you may have, Ms. Huddleston, and the materials and information she brought to you on the manuscripts.
First of all, I want to thank you so much for a very, very interesting program and presentation. And I think you raised very fundamental issues because with art, with your photographs, and your particular focus on photography as art, you add, several dimensions. First of all, you add a memory dimension, and it is this memory which is kept through art, by painting, by music, it is the memory that transcends war, and people can then remember a world better or another world before the war, before destruction. And I think it is critical because art also preserves culture, and once there is war, culture is often destroyed, annihilated, and yet it is only the works of art that it is preserved and passed on. But my question is more in terms of access. You said you spent communication? And I'm going to ask you the question, was it, in what language were you communicating? And was communication an issue? Did it because it was coming from two different cultures and two different worldviews, did it have an impact in shaping your work?
Right.
So that's my question.
I'm sure it did. I speak French quite well, so I did most of my research in French, and most of the people I spoke with could speak French. It was a second language for both of us, so that that's always an issue. They spoke it better than me in most cases. There were some people I worked with, of course, who didn't speak French and who only spoke Songhai or Tamashek, or preferred, in fact, to conduct the interview in Arabic. And when that was the case, I used a translator who translated those languages to French towards me. The great advantage I had was that I was there for 10 months. And I definitely could not have gotten the photographs I did or the depth of understanding I did without that amount of time. And I think that language is an issue, but in fact, cross-cultural gaps in communication are perhaps even more of an issue. So most of the people I worked with, I would explain my project to them, and they wanted to help me. They liked the idea. I got along well with them. They thought it was important. I didn't face people who were trying to put roadblocks in my way. However, most of them, they don't know what a photographer wants or what even an American won't understand. Things that are obvious to them or completely, like the fact that you'd never throw away a scrap of paper with a verse of the Quran written on it, were completely mysterious to me. So it was less a language issue, in fact, and more of an issue of my just having to be there for long enough to be able to sense where those gaps were, right? Again, not because people were trying to hide anything, but simply because they could not imagine that I wouldn't know or that it would interest me.
And I think that's another fact about art. There is an empathy and an intuition that comes through artistic production that goes beyond language and beyond the work, and that is so essential.
Well, you're showing a commitment, in there. Go ahead.
You mentioned that the people welcomed you, but my question is about the photography per se. It's my understanding that in Islamic culture, they frown upon photography, taking live images and so on. How did you get them to accept you as a photographer?
Well, as with many issues, there's a whole spectrum, right? Islam is a world religion. So as it manifests itself at different points in time and in different parts of the world, different strictures and different points of faith are going to be emphasized. So in West Africa, people really have no problems with taking pictures. People have, the main issue people have with their picture being taken is during the 19th century, I think there were some beliefs that actually came out of the animist tradition of being afraid of having your image taken. But that's not at play currently in Malian culture. Where you find difficulty in having your picture taken in West Africa, which it is a difficult place for photographers, quite frankly, but that is not a religious issue. It's actually an issue of, you might say, due respect. People are very conscious of their own dignity, and so if you do not approach the situation giving them due respect and consideration, they will be offended by having their photograph taken. But there are photo studios all over Mali. I mean, Mali is what, I don't know, 90% Muslim? Has been, for centuries. It's a fully Muslim country, but there really are no issues within Malian culture, within traditional West African Islamic culture with having images taken. Of course, there are more people who believe in a much stricter form of practice, who might have their own specific requirements.
Did you have to get special permission from any agency?
I mean, as a Fulbrighter, since I was there officially as a researcher for 10 months, I did get a research permit from the Department of Culture, I think it was, at the very beginning. In Timbuktu, everybody knew what I was doing. I had two main organizations that essentially were sponsoring me. One thing about the Fulbright, which I think is actually really good, is you have to have a local sponsoring organization. You have to. So already before I even received the grant, I had set up with Savamba DCI, which was still is a local NGO, very, very actively involved in preserving the manuscripts of Timbuktu and helping individual families build manuscript libraries. So they knew who I was, they knew what I was going to do. When I arrived in town, they took me around. So, I mean, you're not seeing, the pictures might appear candid, but the key to getting candid photography is to sit down with people ahead of time, explain what you're doing, get permission to be there, and then be in the situation and let them do what they do and take the pictures after they are, now not bothered by your presence.
Yes, first, I thank you for your observations, particularly the one about time. As a fellow Fulbrighter, I found the same thing. Time is what's required. So many studies are short-term.
Right.
So many. Your findings are an artifact of the length of time you spend. Very unpopular information in places like the world back to us for short-term studies. But I wanted to ask a further question. I wonder if you found variation in the way different people understood both these texts and these terms. I say that as someone who focused on first birthrights among women in Europe, where I found the men gave you one account, and they pretty much all shared it. Women gave you another account, and they pretty much all shared it. Very, very radically different things. Women who saw seclusion in the hut as their reward for having won the battle, having bled each other. Men who saw it as encapsulating them in the hut, protecting them like the form that it does.
Right.
Did you get any of that sense of differentiation, varying interpretations in text or terms by gender or by women?
First, I don't think I can answer your specific question with regards to texts and tombs. And that's because, in a certain way, my book is like an overview. I'm not a PhD in ethnography, right? So I wasn't there, probably as you were, to do this kind of very in-depth questioning. I was there really to document the cultural matrix as a whole, and hopefully do so in a way through photography that could make it all this, people like John Hunwick have studied these issues before I got there, but his work is not going to be accessible to the general public, right? So my goal was to do this in a way through photography, so that the photography could act as a bridge, right, between the culture in Timbuktu and people who are interested outside of Timbuktu. And in some ways, like if you read the captions, I realize this now even more. if you read the captions to the different photographs, they're almost like, if you want to do a research subject, here's a research subject. Not a lot of people, you can do your whole PhD on this. And here's another subject you can do your entire PhD on. And oh, by the way, here's another subject you can do your entire PhD on. And I'm not doing a PhD on any specific thing. I'm basically kind of presenting all this information in a way that is interesting to scholars, but also accessible to the general public. But in terms of your general question, people having different interpretations, my general answer is going to be kind of annoying because it's going to be yes and no. Because for those of you who've been to Mali, I think you understand what I'm saying when I think it's the most on-message culture I've ever been to. And it's like there are certain catchphrases for things that are used constantly from north to south, which seem to be the sort of understood knee-jerk way of explaining something. And actually, if you sort of read a survey of articles written by different journalists about the manuscripts of Timbuktu, I think you're starting to see that come through. At the same time, of course, in every single culture, every single individual is going to have a different interpretation of any ritual, any object. And it's going to be determined by who they were taught by, what teacher in their school, in their home, what their personal experience, how their personal experience shaped their interaction. Now, the interesting thing is that this very answer of mine, it would be probably heresy in a very orthodox culture, to say that there are always intrinsically, by human nature, multiple interpretations of beliefs and objects and events. But that's something I believe.
Were there any things that were absolutely forbidden to you as a non-Muslim person? Because, in a lot of different religions, it's like certain things can be open, but other things are strictly reserved for people who are within the faith.
Right. Yeah, actually, when I first visited Timbuktu in 2003, you could actually go in the Great Mosque and visit as a tourist, which I did. But probably in response, or I should say certainly in response to this growing pressure of outside preachers coming in, preaching a more conservative Islam, as well as some events that are hard to know if they actually occurred or if they're just hypocritical about tourists not acting properly in various mosques. By the time I was there back in 2007, non-Muslims couldn't go into mosques. So none of my photographs are inside a mosque. Most of the teachers of the Marabout I asked that I could photograph said yes, no problem. When I worked in Timbuktu, I dressed, fairly conservatively, always long pants, long sleeves. I didn't wear a headscarf, but I wore like a bandana covering on my head, which quite frankly was just practical. We're in the desert. so you want to dress that way anyway. And I only had one Marabout who, when I went to photograph his majlis, he wanted me to wear a skirt. That was fine, I did, no problem. And one other Marabout who didn't want me to photograph him, and that was fine. But that's out of, 10, 15 or more people.
As you noted, war changes things and war changes people. In light of that, do you plan to go back to an actor?
I would really like to, for sure. I think I'll probably, Timbuktu for sure, I'll have to wait a bit. And in terms of the south of Mali, I think for me, it's probably still wise to wait a little longer. But, I first went to Mali when I was 6 years old. And I went to the French school there, Libertéa, for 3 years. And so, it's a place that's very important to me. And so, for sure, I would like to go back. Yeah.
Okay.
One question's about the manuscripts, actually. I hear most collections are in private hands, and the idea of them being threatened. What's being done in order to preserve them? And did you get a sense that they were being threatened, or what's being done exactly?
So, actually, a large portion of the manuscripts are in this government library, manuscript library, that I guess in 2008 was actually after I had left. When I was there, they had a building for it, but it was pretty basic. Nice, but basic. And then in 2008, this South African funded, I guess, very beautiful building to house the government collection in Timbuktu was built. And then, so you had that as kind of the center, right, the centerpiece. And then you had many families with manuscript collections of various sizes, right? Some like the Mama Haidara Library. I think they have like 9,000 manuscripts. The Kati Foundation, I lived with them. They have over 7,000. And then other families, it could vary from 100 to, a couple of books. Because manuscripts, essentially, if you think about what they are, the term manuscript is a really loaded term. It sounds kind of sexy, right? But what are manuscripts? Manuscripts are also legal documents, contracts for ownership of property, marriage contracts, and all the rest. So most long-standing families in Timbuktu are going to have a few. That makes sense. So when I was there in 2007, the big push was to help the families who still wanted to keep the manuscripts in their own possession rather than give them to the government library, to provide, to build rooms and shelving, etc., that could properly protect them from dangers all manuscripts have in normal times, right? Humidity and flooding and mice and insects, right? So have, insecticide-treated shelving and have it in a room, probably not air conditioned because you can't rely on the electricity, but that was a room that was in a fairly stable location, this sort of thing. That was the big push, and of course to digitize that. I will say that even when I was there in 2007, people had already been kidnapped, right, in the region. I would have loved to go to Bujabeha and other places that had manuscript collections way out in the middle of the desert, and I chose not to because the Malians I spoke with, told me they can guarantee my safety in Timbuktu. But, whenever you take a 4x4 out into the desert, there's always some risk. So even at that time, the potential for unrest was known. And very unfortunately, of course, that all exploded in the most extreme form in 2012, sorry. And what happened at that time is that a lot of the manuscripts were smuggled, and many of you probably heard this story in the press, right? It was smuggled by donkey and by pirogue, and this kind of amazing clandestine effort was smuggled to the south. Some of them were just hidden locally, too, right? Depending on where they were and what kind of high or low profile location they were in, so what the danger was. And then now what you have is you have hundreds of thousands of manuscripts hidden in the north, and some not hidden, but in a secret location in Bamako, where, of course, it's much, much more humid. So there have been quite a number of efforts with the Ford Foundation, the Prince Claus Foundation, some private crowdfunding too, to raise funds for at least the manuscripts in the south to find the materials, the like boxes with humidity traps and all the rest, to properly house them in a fairly stable manner until hopefully in the future they can be returned to Timbuktu. I only photographed a few of the shrines, partly because it's, I think you asked before about situations that were difficult to photograph. The praying at the tombs of the saints happens inside a cemetery, and there are like, I'm not sure, 5 or 6 very important cemeteries in Timbuktu, and I never felt that it was right for me to enter the cemeteries. So when I would photograph that, it was always from outside the gate, which seemed fun. No one had any trouble with that. So largely, often, most of the time when people are buried within the Muslim religion, there isn't much of a structure, right? There's not even like a headstone. In Timbuktu, often there be pots and other things in the area, but people know where their family is buried because they know. So some of the structures to the saints are large and identifiable, but others are much less so. The militants targeted the large and identifiable structures and destroyed, from what I can gather, most of those. And what was really unfortunate especially is some of the saints were buried in the retaining wall of the main mosque, Jingaribert, and they destroyed the part of the mosque that contained those shrines.
One more question.
I was intrigued by the title, and it's sort of a follow-up to the previous question. The 333 saint shrines. Now, is 333 a real number, or is it a symbolic number? Is there something, sacred about the number?
From what I can gather, it's very much a real number. I myself could not list all the saints, but from my understanding, there are those knowledgeable in Timbuktu who could. For sure, it's also a very sacred number within the kind of the mythological numerology, actually around the world, not just in Sufi-influenced cultures. That begs the question, what if there was a new saint? Would you have to move it to 334? I think there'd be some cultural resistance to that because it's such an enshrined number in the cultural consciousness of Timbuktu. And in fact, that is how Timbuktu is known, right? Just like we have, but I don't know, but New Mexico is the state of enchantment, right? And we have that on the license plate, and that's a catchphrase, land of enchantment. Timbuktu is the city of 333 saints. That phrase goes with Timbuktu in Mali culturally in the same way that land of enchantment, New Mexico. What is DC? I don't know. Okay, so they have some new cultural construct happening, but so what is it? Which is the Constitution state? One of them, right? So, but a lot of states have kept their old catchphrases in the same way. So, and in the central plaza of Timbuktu, there was a painted sign that said the city of 333 saints. And when the Islamists came, they blacked out that sign because the very idea of the importance of saints in the more conservative Wahhabist tradition is very, very frowned upon. And in fact, this battle between, this iconoclastic battle, which, that's why I think Seamus Heaney is a really relevant person to quote, right? Protestant Catholicism fighting it out in Northern Ireland. You have an interesting kind of parallel going on in the Muslim world. It's not just Mali where this is happening. Sufi shrines have been attacked in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Afghanistan, all over the Muslim world. And in fact, the fact that it entered that in this instance in Timbuktu, the issue entered the front page of international press worldwide was kind of a first. But it's something that's been occurring for years.
Well, I would like to thank Alexandria again for your very important research that you did on the manuscripts. And I would, at this point in time, I want everyone to have an opportunity to actually see your book and have you sign the books that they would like to get at this point in time. And I want to give you a round of applause for that.
Thank you all for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.